My hands were shaking as I stared at the certified letter on my bed. It was dated March 14th, 3 days after my 18th birthday. The letterhead belonged to Clearwater Trust Administration, and the content was simple, clinical, devastating. "Dear Ms. Sarah Mitchell," it began, "we regret to inform you that your trust account has been flagged for unauthorized access attempts. On March 11th, a request was submitted by Jennifer Mitchell, account co-signatory, to liquidate funds ahead of the projected distribution date of March 15th. My mother had tried to steal $487,000. I read the next line 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Due to early detection protocols and security measures, this request was blocked. Your full account balance remains intact. I sat on the edge of my bed in my small bedroom, the letter trembling between my fingers. Outside my window, spring rain fell against the glass. Everything looked normal. The same street, the same houses, the same world I'd been living in for 18 years. But everything had changed 3 days ago, and I had seen it coming for months. My name is Sarah Mitchell. Until March 11th, I thought I knew my mother. I grew up in a 3-bedroom suburban home on Elmwood Drive in Portland, Oregon. My father died when I was 4. I don't have real memories of him, just photographs and the kind of vague warmth that comes from people telling you they loved you. What I do remember clearly is my mother raising me alone, working as a dental hygienist, always tired, always reaching for the next paycheck. My dad left behind 2 things, a modest life insurance policy and a trust fund. The money was protected by law until I turned 18. It was supposed to help me start college, buy a car, maybe pay for grad school. It was security. It was my future. It was the only inheritance I'd ever receive from a father I barely knew. My mom used to talk about that money differently depending on who was listening. To her friends during book club, she'd say things like, "Sarah's so lucky. That inheritance will set her up for life." I'd hear it from the kitchen while washing dishes, her voice measured and light, like she was genuinely happy for me. To me, when we were alone, the conversation was different. "You know how much that trust cost me," she'd say, usually while cooking dinner, her back to me as she stirred something on the stove. 18 years of raising you alone, 18 years of working double shifts. That money should really be split fairly between us." I was 15, the first time she said something like that. I remember freezing at the kitchen table, my algebra homework suddenly meaningless. "Mom, Dad's will." "Your father's will was written by someone who barely knew me," she interrupted, turning to face me. Her expression wasn't angry. That was the confusing part. She looked sad, almost disappointed. "He didn't know what it would cost to raise you. He didn't know I'd spend 20 years alone. That money was meant for both of us." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was 15. I was small and uncertain and desperate not to disappoint her, so I said nothing. That was my first mistake. By the time I turned 16, the conversations became more frequent. They also became more specific. "When you turn 18, she'd say, "we can take that money out and buy a house together. A real house, not this rental, somewhere with an actual yard. Wouldn't that be nice?" The way she said it made it sound inevitable, like we'd already decided, like it was our plan. I knew it wasn't. But my mother had a gift for that, making things sound like they were your idea, when really they were hers. By 17, I'd stopped arguing. I'd stopped telling her that the money was legally mine, that it was meant for my education, that her name on the account as a guardian was meant for managing it, not accessing it. I'd learned that these logical arguments only made her cry or angry, and I hated both reactions equally. So instead, I watched her. I started paying attention in a different way. I noticed that her credit card statements came in the mail, and some months they were much higher than others. I noticed that conversations with her sister would end abruptly when I entered the room. I noticed that she started asking questions about my college plans with less interest, and more questions about when exactly the trust fund would be available. I noticed that she never actually asked me directly. She just started acting like she'd already decided. And that's when I understood something my 15-year-old self couldn't have comprehended. My mother wasn't trying to persuade me. She was preparing me for a decision she'd already made. The actual betrayal didn't announce itself with drama. It started with a simple email. I found it by accident on a Wednesday afternoon in late February. I was using my mom's laptop to download some college applications. Mine was broken, and I'd opened her email while looking for the confirmation link she'd promised to send me. That's when I saw it. An email from Clearwater Trust Administration, dated February 23rd. The subject line read, "Liquidation request, account 4,782,960, processing." My fingers went cold. The email was addressed to my mother. It contained technical language about early liquidation provisions, guardian access protocols, and full account transfer. There was an account number that matched my trust fund account. There was a date, March 11th, 12 days before my 18th birthday. The email explained that my mother had successfully submitted a request to liquidate the full account balance before the official distribution date. Apparently, there was a clause in my father's trust that allowed the guardian to access the funds in case of family financial emergency. My mother had apparently classified herself as an emergency. I read the email 5 times without breathing properly. Then I closed the laptop and sat very still in the living room, listening to the clock tick. My mother was at work. She worked Wednesdays from 8 in the morning until 6 at night. That gave me about 4 hours to understand what was happening. I went to my room and locked the door, something I rarely did, and I pulled out my own phone. I opened the Clearwater Trust website, logged into my account with the credentials they'd sent me on my 16th birthday, and navigated to the account history. There it was. A request submitted on February 22nd, signed with my mother's name and guardian ID number. The request specifically asked to liquidate the entire balance and transfer it to an account in her name only. The status showed, pending approval. That was the moment everything changed. Not because she was doing this, I'd suspected something like this was coming, but because she hadn't told me. She hadn't asked. She hadn't even warned me or given me a chance to argue or comply or do anything except discover it like a thief discovering a locked safe. She'd been planning to steal from me while I slept. I spent the next hour researching trust fund laws in Oregon. Then I called my father's old attorney, a man named Robert Chen, whose name I'd found in a file cabinet in the hall closet. He was in his 60s now, and he seemed surprised to hear from me. "Sarah, is everything okay?" he asked after I identified myself. I told him what I'd found. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "I need to be very careful about what I say here," he said slowly, "because your mother is the current guardian. But I can tell you that what you're describing would be a violation of fiduciary duty and possibly fraud." My heart started beating very fast. "But there's a clause," I said, "an emergency clause." "There is," he confirmed, "but emergency clauses are typically interpreted narrowly. A parent needing to pay down debt or wanting to finance a lifestyle upgrade wouldn't qualify. And frankly, if your mother hasn't disclosed this to you, that's a red flag." He paused. "Have you asked your mother about this directly?" he asked. I lied and said yes, that she'd mentioned wanting to help with college costs. He didn't sound convinced, but he didn't push. Before I hung up, he gave me his cell phone number and told me something I'll never forget. "Sarah," he said, "I knew your father. He was careful with money. He was careful with decisions. This trust fund, he set it up the way he did because he wanted it to go to you. Just you. Not as a shared family asset, but as yours, as your future. I think he would want you to protect that." When I hung up, I sat in the silence of my room for a long time. My mother would be home in 3 hours. And I had to decide what I was going to do. I didn't confront her immediately. That would have been the normal thing to do. That would have been what she'd expect. And if there's one thing I'd learned about my mother, it was that she was always one step ahead of expectations. So instead, I did something else. I watched her. When she came home that Wednesday, she was cheerful. She asked me about school. She made pasta for dinner. She hummed while she cleaned the kitchen. There was no guilt in her movements, no nervousness in her voice. She looked exactly like a woman with a clear conscience. And that terrified me more than anything else could have. The next morning, she brought it up casually. "Hey, so I've been thinking about something," she said while we were having breakfast. I was eating cereal. She was scrolling through her phone. "What would you think about us getting a new place together after graduation? Nothing huge, just a little condo in the Pearl District, somewhere nice." I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds expensive," I said. "It would be," she agreed, setting down her phone and looking at me with that particular smile. The one that made her look younger, more vulnerable. "But with your trust fund, we could actually make it happen. It would be an investment. We could build equity together." There it was. The reframing, the magic trick. She wasn't stealing. She was investing. She wasn't taking something that belonged to me. We were building something together. "I thought that money was supposed to be for college," I said quietly. "College is expensive, sure," she said, "but there are loans, scholarships, other options. This opportunity with the condo, it comes down now. Real estate in Portland is booming. If we don't buy now, we'll miss the window." I set down my spoon. "Mom, that's my inheritance from Dad." She flinched at that, just slightly, just enough that I knew I'd hit something true. "I know," she said softly, "and I'm not taking it from you. I'm just suggesting we use it wisely, together, as a family." There was no family anymore. It was just us. And she was counting on that fact, counting on the possibility that I was lonely enough, needy enough, desperate enough for family that I'd give up my entire future to maintain the fiction of one. "I need to think about it," I said. She smiled and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Of course you do," she said. "You're smart. That's what I've always loved about you. You think things through." But she was already planning. I could see it in the way she let go of my hand. She'd already moved past this conversation. In her mind, it was settled. The pressure came over the next 2 weeks in small ways. There was a dress code issue at school. My mom said we couldn't afford new uniform requirements. Didn't I think it would be nice to have money for things like that, once we got the condo and I had access to the trust fund? There was a conversation at her work where she apparently told a colleague that I was coming into some money soon, and that she was so proud of how responsible I was, how I wanted to help my mother after all the sacrifices she'd made. There was a parent-teacher conference where my guidance counselor mentioned to my mom that I was applying to schools out of state, expensive schools. My mom came home and casually mentioned how much better a local school would be, how she'd miss me if I left, how it would be nice if we had a place together anyway, didn't I think? Each one was a separate pressure point. But together, they formed a picture. A picture of my mother slowly preparing the narrative of a girl who wanted to give up her future for her parents' comfort. A girl who was grateful and loving and understood sacrifice. A girl who could be persuaded. The humiliation came from a direction I didn't anticipate. It was my Uncle David who did it, though I doubt he understood the role he was playing. He came over on a Sunday in early March, just 5 days before my birthday. He brought wine for my mom and a gift card for me, $50, which was nice, though increasingly I understood that small gestures meant nothing. After dinner, while I was clearing the table, I heard my mom talking to him in the living room. "I'm really worried about Sarah," she was saying, her voice lowered. "I don't think she's ready for the responsibility of managing that much money on her own. She's still so young, you know, so inexperienced with financial decisions." My hands went still on the plate I was holding. "Maybe that's normal," my uncle said. 18-year-olds usually aren't that experienced." "That's exactly my point," my mom said. "Without guidance, I think she could make really destructive choices. I'm thinking that maybe the best thing would be for me to manage the trust fund for a few more years, just until she's more mature. I'd keep it safe for her. I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, able to see them in profile through the living room entrance. My mom was doing that thing with her voice, the sad, concerned thing. The thing that made people want to take care of her, to agree with her, to protect her from the burden of having a difficult child. My uncle was nodding, sympathetically. "You've always been a great mother, Jen," he said. "Sarah's lucky to have you." And something inside me broke a little at that. Because the horrible truth was, she probably believed it too. She probably genuinely saw herself as protecting me, not stealing from me. She probably had constructed an entire narrative where she was the selfless guardian, and I was the ungrateful child who didn't understand her own needs. That was the most humiliating part. Not that she was trying to take the money, but that she'd made me question whether she was right too. 3 days before my 18th birthday, I stopped asking for permission. I didn't have a dramatic realization moment. I didn't suddenly become cold or hardened or vengeful. What happened was more subtle than that. What happened was that I simply looked at the situation clearly for the first time. My mother was going to try to steal from me. She had already filed paperwork to do it. And no amount of convincing her of the morality of the situation, no amount of emotional honesty or vulnerability was going to change her mind. Because in her mind, she wasn't doing anything wrong. I needed to stop treating this like a conversation and start treating it like a conflict. I needed to think like someone who was under threat. Because I was. On March 10th, the day before my 18th birthday, I went to the Clearwater Trust Administration office in downtown Portland. I'd looked up their address online. I'd dressed carefully in the navy blazer I wore for presentations at school, the one that made me look professional and old enough to be taken seriously. I'd practiced what I was going to say. The office was on the 7th floor of a glass building overlooking Pioneer Courthouse Square. The walls were beige. The carpet was gray. Everything was designed to make you feel like you were handling serious financial matters, which I suppose I was. The receptionist, a woman with kind eyes and reading glasses on a beaded chain, asked if I had an appointment. "I don't," I said, "but I'm here about my trust fund account and it's urgent. Is there someone I can speak with?" Urgency works. Adults respond to it. Within 5 minutes, I was sitting in a small conference room with a woman named Margaret Torres, who was apparently the account manager for my trust. I showed her my ID. I logged into my account from the desktop computer she offered, and then I explained what was happening. "I need to modify the guardianship structure on this account," I said, and I was proud that my voice didn't shake. "I'm 18 as of tomorrow. I want to know what protections I have against unauthorized liquidation attempts." Margaret's expression changed immediately. She pulled up my account history on her own computer and scrolled through the notes section. I watched her face as she read. "I see a liquidation request filed by Jennifer Mitchell on February 22nd, she said slowly. "This would normally be in process, but it appears to have been flagged by our fraud detection system 3 days ago." "Why?" I asked. "That's interesting," she said, frowning. "The note here says that the request was flagged because it came from a new device that didn't match the account holder's typical access pattern. Usually that would be no problem, but because this was a full liquidation request rather than a standard withdrawal, our system required secondary verification." She turned to look at me. "Did you verify it?" she asked. "No," I said. "I never received any verification requests." "And you're requesting that we decline the pending liquidation?" "Yes," I said, "and I'd like to remove my mother as a co-signatory on this account, effective immediately." It took about 30 minutes to complete the paperwork. Margaret was professional but kind about it. She didn't ask prying questions about why I was removing my mother, but I could tell she understood. She'd probably seen this situation before. "Once you turn 18 tomorrow, you have full control over this account," she explained. "Your mother's guardian status expires automatically. I'm going to remove her as a co-signatory today, after close of business. The pending liquidation request will be automatically denied tomorrow when the system processes the status change. What happens to the request itself? I asked. It stays in the system as a declined transaction, she said. There's a permanent record of it, and there will be documentation sent to both of you notifying you of the denial. That's when I understood what was going to happen. My mother was going to receive a letter telling her that her theft had been discovered and prevented. And she was going to know immediately that I was responsible. I'd been expecting to have more time. I'd been expecting to graduate quietly, start college, put distance between us before the real confrontation. But there was no time now. There was only tomorrow. Walking back to my car, I felt something strange. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't rage, it was clarity. For the first time in 2 years, I knew exactly what I needed to do. And I knew exactly why my mother would never see it coming. I spent my 18th birthday systematically documenting evidence. I started with the emails. I went back through every email my mother had ever sent me, and every email I could access that she'd sent to other people. I took screenshots of the liquidation request from the trust website. I found the spreadsheets she'd created. She'd been careless enough to name one, house fund options, and it contained price comparisons for condos in the Pearl District, alongside calculations of my trust fund balance minus various percentages. She wasn't just taking the money, she was planning how to spend it. Next, I started recording. This part took courage. I downloaded a call recording app that was legal in Oregon, one that records calls with my consent, the consent of the other party. I'd looked up the legality carefully. In Oregon, you can record phone calls if you're a participant in the conversation and you have consent from the other party. The consent part was going to be tricky. But I had an idea. That evening, I told my mother that I wanted to talk about the trust fund. She smiled. She probably thought I was ready to capitulate. We sat down in the living room, and I called the Clearwater Trust office and put them on speaker, ostensibly so we could all discuss the account together. Before they came on the line, I said clearly into the phone, "I'm recording this call for my records. Is that okay?" The voice on the other end, not Margaret but another representative, said yes, absolutely. My mother didn't object. She probably didn't even fully register what I'd said. What I'd done was legally record a conversation, and everything she said during that conversation would be on record. She admitted it all. Not in those exact words, but she admitted it in the way she defended her actions, in the way she explained how the money was really a shared responsibility, in the way she said things like, "I think it's only fair that I have access to manage Sarah's account, and she wouldn't have gotten this money without me raising her, and I'm not taking anything, I'm just moving it around." The Clearwater representative remained professional and neutral throughout, which was perfect. They didn't argue with her. They just stated the facts of what had happened and what would happen next. By the time we hung up, I had an audio recording of my mother essentially confessing to her intentions. I saved it to a file. I backed it up to 2 different cloud accounts. I emailed it to myself. Over the next few days, I became a documentarian of her behavior. I wrote down dates and times of conversations. I recorded her casual mentions of the condo, of the money, of our future together. I created a timeline that mapped out exactly when her liquidation request had been filed and what it corresponded with in her life. A new car she'd suddenly mentioned wanting, a credit card payment she'd made that she thought I didn't know about. I was building a case. Not against her exactly, but a case nonetheless. Evidence of premeditation, proof that this wasn't a desperate impulse or a genuine misunderstanding. This was planned theft. On March 15th, the official distribution date, Clearwater Trust sent a notification email to both of us. Subject: Trust Account Status Update, Account 4,782,960. It explained that my account had now fully transferred to my name alone. It mentioned that the previously pending liquidation request had been declined due to account status change. It provided information about my new account access. My mother read it at the breakfast table. I watched her face as she processed the information. First confusion, then the moment of understanding, then anger. "You went to the bank," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "Without telling me." "Yes." "Sarah," she set down her phone. "We were supposed to discuss this together." "Were we?" I asked quietly. "Or were you planning to take the money and tell me afterwards?" The silence that followed was very long. "You're 18 now," she said finally, her voice controlled. "You can make your own mistakes, but don't blame me when you waste that money on stupid things and end up regretting it." "I won't," I said. And that was the end of the conversation. But it wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of the part where she started trying to convince me that I was the bad guy. Everything I've told you so far is true. But there's something I didn't know. Not until I met with my father's attorney, Robert Chen, 3 weeks after my birthday. He'd reached out to me, saying he had some documents he wanted me to have. When I got to his office, a small book-lined space on a side street in northeast Portland, he looked troubled. "Sarah," he said after we'd exchanged greetings, "I need to tell you something. It's about your mother." He pulled out a file folder. Inside were documents from 1992, the year after my father had created his original will. "Your father came to me 3 months before he died," Robert said, "and he told me something that deeply concerned him. He said that your mother had been pressuring him to change the trust structure so that she would have control over distributions." My stomach twisted. "He wanted to make sure," Robert continued, "that under no circumstances would your mother be able to access this money for herself. So he created a specific addendum to the trust. Your mother could serve as a guardian and make decisions about health care and education and day-to-day finances. But the trust itself was locked, completely locked, except for distributions to you." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I made a promise to your father," Robert said. "I promised that if anything happened, if there was ever any indication that your mother would try to access the trust, I would make sure you understood why he'd structured it that way." He leaned forward. "Sarah, your father loved your mother, but he didn't trust her with money, and apparently he was right not to." There was something else in his expression. "There's more," I said. He nodded slowly. "Your father's insurance policy, the one that funded the trust, it had a specific clause. The trust was designed to grow until you turned 18, at which point the full balance would become yours. But the amount he put away was much more than you know." He slid a document across the desk. It was the original trust agreement. And at the bottom, where it listed the initial investment amount, I saw a number I'd never seen before. $850,000. Not $487,000, which was the amount my mother thought was in the account. But $850,000. "What happened to the money?" I whispered. "It grew," Robert said. "Your father was very strategic. He invested it conservatively, but over 18 years, with compound interest and some very smart decisions, the original amount nearly doubled." I couldn't breathe. "Your mother didn't know?" I asked. "Not the real amount," Robert confirmed. "The trust documents she had access to as a guardian showed a much lower figure. Your father was very explicit about that. He updated her on your account only with general information. She saw that you had a trust fund, but she never saw the actual balance. So she was trying to steal $487,000, I said slowly, but she didn't know there was more than that." "Exactly. Why would my dad do this?" Robert took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Because he loved you more," he said simply, "and because he didn't trust your mother with the truth." 3 weeks later, my mother asked if we could sit down and have a serious conversation. We were in the living room. It was early evening. That particular shade of light in spring, when the sun turns everything golden, and you can almost pretend the world is simpler than it actually is. "I've been thinking about what happened," she said, "and I want to apologize." I waited. I was wrong, she continued. I was stressed about money, and I let that stress make me do something I shouldn't have. I should have asked you directly instead of trying to do it secretly. You were right to be upset. It was a good apology. It had all the right elements, but it was wrong in a fundamental way. You're not apologizing for trying to take the money, I said. You're apologizing for getting caught. Her face hardened. That's not fair, Sarah. Isn't it? I leaned forward slightly. Because if I hadn't found that email, if I hadn't gone to the bank, we would be having a very different conversation right now. You'd be explaining to me why the money was gone and making me feel guilty for not understanding your sacrifices. You don't understand how hard it's been, she said, her voice rising. Raising you alone, working all those jobs, giving up everything. And you don't understand, I said quietly, that none of that gives you the right to steal from me. That's not a sacrifice, that's entitlement. She stood up. I think you should leave, she said. I live here, I said. Not for long, she said. You're 18, you can move out. And there it was. The moment when she couldn't manipulate anymore, so she defaulted to rejection. Actually, I said, I came here to tell you something. I've contacted a lawyer. I have documentation of your liquidation attempt. I have recordings of our conversations, and I'm planning to file a report with Clearwater Trust requesting a formal investigation into your actions as a guardian. She went very white. You wouldn't. I would, I said calmly. I have to, because even though you didn't take my money this time, you tried. And the only way to make sure it doesn't happen again is to make sure you never have that kind of access to a trust account ever again. You'd report your own mother. Her voice was barely a whisper. I'd protect myself, I said. I stood up. There's something else you should know, I continued. The trust fund I inherited, it's worth more than you thought. My father kept the real amount secret from you. The whole time you were planning to take $487,000, there was actually $850,000 in that account. He did that on purpose. He didn't trust you with the truth. I watched her process this information. And in that moment, I saw something crack inside her. Not regret, exactly, but the dawning realization that she'd lost. That she'd been outplayed not just by her daughter, but by her dead ex-husband, who had understood her so well that he'd planned for exactly this scenario. I'm leaving, I said. I'll be back to get my things in the next few days. When I do, I'd suggest you have your own lawyer ready because you're going to need one. I walked out of the living room. I walked upstairs to my room. I packed a small bag with the things I cared about most, and I left the house. It was 6:47 p.m. on April 2nd. The sun was still golden on the street. The formal investigation took 4 months. Clearwater Trust reviewed all of the documents, the recordings, the timeline of events. They brought in a fraud investigator. They interviewed my mother twice. In September, they sent us both official notices. My mother was permanently barred from serving as a guardian on any trust account. She was banned from Clearwater Trust for life, and she was required to complete a formal statement acknowledging that she had attempted to commit trust fund fraud. For my part, I made the decision not to press criminal charges. I knew that would sound weak to some people, but I understood something important. I didn't need to destroy her. I just needed her to understand that I was stronger. And she did. Because for months afterward, she tried to contact me through my uncle, through my high school guidance counselor, through mutual friends. She cried. She insisted that I'd misunderstood her intentions. She said I was ruining her life. And I didn't respond. Silence, I learned, is a kind of power that loud confrontation can never be. I applied to college. I got into 3 excellent schools. I chose the one 3,000 miles away from Portland. In the fall, I moved into my dorm room with my $850,000 trust fund, securing my future in a way that my mother's need could never touch. I didn't vanish from her life completely. I'm not cruel. I send her a text on her birthday. I respond to her calls occasionally. I see her maybe once a year in public spaces where we can maintain a polite fiction of a relationship. But I'm never vulnerable with her again. Because I learned something that most people don't understand until much later in life, if at all. The people who love you don't exploit your love for them. The people who care about your future don't try to steal it. And the people who claim to sacrifice everything for you are usually counting on you never realizing what those sacrifices cost you, rather than them. I look at my mother now, and I don't see the woman who raised me. I see someone who looked at her child's future and decided it should be hers. And I see someone who lost because she bet on the wrong daughter. She bet on a girl who would be too young to understand, too guilty to argue, too loving to protect herself. She didn't bet on a girl who was watching, who was learning, who was already 3 steps ahead, building a case out of screenshots and recordings and lawyer consultations, waiting for the moment when she would finally be old enough to fight back. I am 23 now. I have a degree. I have a job I love. I have friends who don't try to steal from me, who don't gaslight me, who don't pretend that their failures are my responsibility. And I have the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I was smarter than someone who spent 18 years trying to outsmart me. That doesn't sound like revenge. But to me, it sounds like justice. It sounds like a girl who became too strong to break. It sounds like survival. And more than anything else, it sounds like freedom. The reason I'm telling you this story isn't because I want you to feel sorry for me. It's because I want you to understand something critical. Betrayal doesn't always come from a stranger. Manipulation doesn't always come from someone obviously dangerous. The people who hurt you worst are often the ones you trusted completely. But here's the other truth. You are stronger than you know. You contain within yourself the capacity to protect yourself, to observe rather than react, to document rather than forget, to plan rather than panic. My mother thought she knew me. She thought she had calculated every weakness, every moment of love that could be leveraged into compliance. But she never calculated that I was already 1 step ahead, watching, recording, preparing. She underestimated me. And that's the most common mistake of all.